23 minutes. That was how long Elena Park stood in the marble foyer while a hall full of relatives watched her like jurors. Her wedding dress was a pale thing of lace and good intentions, the veil sitting on her shoulders more out of expectation than faith. The chandelier above threw a soft golden net that ought to have flattened every anxiety into glamour, but the light only sharpened the tremor at the base of her throat. Around her, crystal glasses chimed, laughter skimmed the room like paper boats, and her mother adjusted a brooch as if officiating a verdict. A photographer hovered, primed for ritual smiles, and the bridal bouquet felt suddenly like an accusation against her palms. She had been told that arrangements were how families protected futures. She had been told that saying nothing was the graceful thing. She had been told to trust. Then her father cleared his throat, a sound she had learned to read like weather. He said a single sentence that had been written in 1,000 meetings, and then polished to brightness. Elena heard it and understood that what followed was not a negotiation. She had been chosen for reasons that were not hers. She felt the room tilt and perceived, with a cruel clarity, that the vows would be spoken while her mouth held other people's words. The officiant smiled at her, the cameras blinked like bugs, and something inside her folded. She stepped back. That retreat became visible. A cousin made a small sound of dismay that gathered into a ripple. In the third row, a woman whispered, louder than the organ, that she had been ungrateful in other seasons. Elena thought of every quiet refusal she had swallowed and felt them rebuke her now as if they were wrong births that deserved punishment. The proceedings continued as choreography. At 23 minutes into the ritual, when her name was about to be called aloud, her phone vibrated against the silk of her dress. She found it and read, with a hope she had not permitted herself to hold, a message from someone she loved from a past life. He had sent 2 words. They were not the words she wanted. They were not a rescue. They were practical and final. The message said, "I cannot risk this." The hall took the message like wind takes a leaf. The priest paused, the band faltered, and every smile turned brittle. For a woman who had spent years teaching middle school science, the publicness of humiliation was a curriculum she had never wanted to pass. Her students could write equations. They did not teach how to become invisible under the eyes of relatives who equated obedience with virtue. Her makeup was unblemished, but her job betrayed her. She heard plates being cleared like a countdown. Tears burned, sudden and hot, and she let them fall because they seemed less guilty than the silence she had maintained for years. He entered like a coma. Cut in the music. Not by the main door, but through a side corridor where the light softened and the staff moved like shadows. At first, no one noticed him. Then someone looked, and that look spread like a signal flare. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like argument, a coat that suggested custom, shoes that clicked precisely on the marble. He carried a small white box and a single flute of champagne. He did not approach with reverence. He walked as if the room owed him patience. He placed the champagne on the table nearest Elena, and then, with a voice that molded itself to the hush, said, "Forgive the interruption. I could not stand to watch someone leave this room thinking they needed permission to breathe." A silence answered, full of curiosity and with the rancor of people whose spectacles had been interrupted. He did not wait for permission to sit. He smiled the way a lighthouse smiles, deliberate and startling. He called himself Michael Reyes. He said he understood what it meant to be given choices that were not yours. He admitted no details of his life and offered a single proposition. "Let me buy you dinner in this very kitchen," he said, as if the statement had been calibrated to be theatrical and kind at once. "If after that you want to return to the decisions that were mapped for you, I will take you back. If you want anything else, we will negotiate a different outcome." He paid cash, quietly, and handed her assistant a crisp note so the cameras would not find the transaction. It was audacious in a way that made her dizzy. He was calm in a way that felt like an outside temperature. He smelled faintly of cedar and the citrus notes of something old money cleansed of show. They walked out into a small courtyard where the winter air made breath into small moons. He offered his arm, not like a monarch, but like someone who had practiced gentleness until it looked inevitable. She took it because the alternative was to watch the rest of her life be settled in that room by people who spoke of alliances as if they were contracts and never human lives. They did not exchange names beyond the ritual. They traded small confessions. He liked espresso that was too dark, he said, and hated ceremonies meant to soothe the guilty. She said she liked teaching because the students told the truth in equations. They traded smiles, measured and then softer. For the first time in a long while, she felt the sensation of being seen rather than assessed. That night, he took her to a small restaurant 2 blocks from the hall where the waiters knew how to pronounce basil without pretending. The place had mismatched chairs and a bar that smelled of stirred citrus. It felt like a hideout. Inside, they ate simply, the food falling warm and honest between them. Conversations braided curiosity with guardedness. He paid the bill and then, when she protested, said, "You are not in need of charity. You are in need of options." The word billionaire was not yet spoken. He said he ran an enterprise of infrastructure, something about building things that lasted. That phrasing was vague. His manners carried authority and explanation in equal parts, and she believed him and did not at the same time. He left an impression of a man who had learned to command rooms and to prefer quiet corners. At the end of the evening, he offered, "Come with me for a while. If I am unbearable in an hour, I will return you to your life and never disturb you again." It was the small contract she had secretly wanted daily for years. She agreed. In the days that followed, Elena discovered that being given an alternative to a predetermined life was both intoxicating and terrifying. Michael did not demand a declaration. He invited experiences that were not ceremonies. They walked through a farmer's market where she bought rosemary from a woman with a laugh like a bell. They went to a used bookshop where the owner, Omar, recommended an out-of-print poetry book that he said reminded him of mornings. They had coffee at a diner where the waitress, Rosa, told stories about her son who learned to play cello. He learned how she kept her grief folded and labeled. He learned what she taught at school. They cooked imperfectly together in a penthouse whose windows framed the city like a map. He was precise with a knife and clumsy with metaphors. He sent a driver to pick up her mother when reconciliation was necessary and joked about the idea of a guard who called himself Sam and who was, in truth, a soft man who cried at old movies. The intimacy grew in increments. A Saturday at a bookstore became a habit. At the market, she tasted an orange and closed her eyes, as if to catalog its exact memory. Michael watched until he could echo what she felt. He introduced her to a circle of people whose names she would learn in the months ahead. There was Naomi, a PR strategist who laughed with her entire face. There was Elliot, Michael's most trusted operations director, who smelled of engine oil and honest labor. There was Dr. Singh, a forensic accountant turned family friend. There was Javier, Michael's childhood friend, who rode the same way the tide rides the moon. They named these people casually, and she realized how large his orbit was. Her days felt quieter and louder at once. Quieter because she did not have to file every breath under duty. Louder because the cameras found them in increments, and tabloids began to stitch together rumors. News spread like mold. A gossip blog posted a photo of them with a caption that called him a benefactor and called her a runaway. Her inbox filled with whispers disguised as concern. The education board that employed her received a call that said that her affiliations might be distracting. Her mother received messages from cousins who suggested that a show of scandal would be less disruptive if mitigated by a quick marriage. It became steadily harder to find normal. At a gallery opening where Michael introduced her as his guest, an ex of his appeared like a shadow from a window. The ex, Dahlia, was all hair and blade, and she smiled the way people do when they are used to being first in headlines. She approached Elena with the casual cruelty of someone who thinks the world is an audience. The exchange was small, and the cameras caught it. The tabloids pounced and invented motives for every smile Elena had given in private. Around then, an anonymous email arrived at Michael's office that carried a file. It contained images taken from a security camera in one of his factories, showing an alteration in a load of materials. Forensic analysts would later call it sabotage. The email had no signature. The images were precise, and the whispers around them louder because they were dressed as facts. Elena read the images like a prophecy. Michael returned from a series of meetings with a face that was both controlled and porous. He told her that he had enemies who liked to use spectacle the way others use currency. He explained in careful sentences the difference between structural integrity and public image. He said that sometimes the two collided in the worst possible way. The next weeks were a cycle of crisis and procedure. A truck that should have held reinforcement beams collapsed its load on a construction site where dozens were gathered. No one died, but a foreman cracked his skull and a scaffold buckled. The tabloids printed headlines that mixed blame and veiled delight. They painted a picture of negligence. Michael's company was accused of cutting corners. Investors stirred. The board demanded answers, even as they sent lawyers into the press. Elena sat where she could see his profile, the set of his jaw, and felt the gravity of a man whose responsibility was measured in safety manuals and in the sound of a metal bending under stress. She heard him on late calls, speaking in the language of calculations and permits. She visited the site wearing a hard hat and asked questions that were not merely naive. She learned that investigations had phases, that evidence could be seeded to mislead, that PR spins could sound like truth if repeated enough. She learned names. Detective Morales at the precinct, who had a way of looking like he could see the shape of the lie before anyone else. She learned the names of the engineers who worked at the plant. She sat in rooms where lawyers said things that meant less than the way Michael's hands were folded. At the center of the crisis, Storm was a man Elena learned to fear and pity at the same time. His name was George Park. He was her father and the architect of the arranged engagement. He came from a family that measured affection by legacy and whose ideas about honor were heavy with paper. His backstory, when she allowed herself to hear it without defending, read like a ledger. He had grown up in a small town where opportunity appeared like a mirage. He left at 17 with a jacket and a suitcase and worked factories until he had enough to buy the smallest parcel of property. He married a woman who could keep house and count and who learned to fold shame into thrift. He built small businesses that folded into bigger ones. He made alliances with men who could call favors through the night. He believed, deeply and unromantically, that power was a way to prevent sorrow. For him, an arranged match was a bridge to stronger stakes for the family. He did not believe in illusions like romanticism. He believed in alliances that could be signed and insured. His life had been a testament to the idea that security was a scaffolding you must sight before the winds came. If you asked him whether he loved his daughter, he would have answered with the currency of protection. He did not know how to translate the need to protect into the language of empathy. The consequence was a life he built with one hand, while another hand measured the cost to those who lived inside the plans. When the sabotage allegations surfaced, George moved like someone who had rehearsed crisis management. He took the microphones and offered statements that mixed moral concern and sculpted outrage. He smelled of cologne and of the dinner table he once preferred to keep traditional. He believed that denying any softness would shield the family. He contacted board members of local charities, sent counsel to the press, and whispered to old colleagues to shape the narrative. But his interventions had a secondary aim. They were not merely about the family business. They were about preserving an image of stoicism that he thought would justify decisions like the one he had made at the altar. He hated being wrong in public, and he feared the small humiliation of having his control appear brittle. That fear made his actions harsher. He saw Michael as an element of chaos, rather than as a man accused by the same savage rumor machine that had pursued him for decades. The conflict between the fathers was not only of businesses, it was a conflict of definitions. One man traded in consolidation, the other in influence dressed as goodwill. Each move was a chess piece that could cut lives. Tension accumulated in scenes that felt like weather. At a press conference where cameras made the light too bright and the statements too brittle, Michael stood with a measured face and read a prepared remark that promised full cooperation. The reporters leaned forward like plants toward rain. A woman from an online tabloid, a small, cruel thing named Lacey, who had built a career on personal collapses, asked a question that was less a question than a barb. She suggested that a man who could afford a penthouse might also have cut corners for profit. Michael answered with steadiness, and then, for the first time, a flash of something like personal fatigue. He said, "There are people here who understand that accountability matters. We will find the truth." He did not shout. He spoke as if telling the truth in a quiet voice might be enough to drown rumor. The cameras caught everything, then leaned into what they could not control, which was the air between his words and the sound that followed from a newsroom. There were moments of scandal that were designed to sting. A leaked email found its way to her mother's social group, full of old grievances. An anonymous tip made a city regulator look into practices at the plant. A doctored recording somehow suggested that Michael had admitted responsibility in a private meeting, and the clip looped like a rope around his neck. Each breach felt like a small surgery. Each shutter click became a stitch in a narrative that would not let him be a human of complexity. Elena watched as he moved through the storm, not unscarred but functional, and started to understand the cost of leading a public company that had people who relied on it. She began to be less the rescued and more the partner who said, "Let us be relentless about the truth." There were moments that nearly broke her. One afternoon, a protest outside their building involved workers who held signs and who chanted with a galvanized rage. The chant was about safety and about wage theft and about accountability. A line of television vans stretched like a spine down the avenue. The protesters had a right to be heard, and the corporations had a right to be scrutinized. The problem was that in the political temperature of the moment, the nuance evaporated. Someone threw a bottle, and it shattered against a security gate. The sound was small and sharp, and it felt apocalyptic. Elena stood with her hands in her coat pockets and felt like something she loved was under siege. In that crowd, a man she barely recognized shoved a photographer, and the camera fell into the gutter. The image of that fall ran overnight with an editorial that suggested chaos. Michael was accused of being too slow with his response and too cold in his empathy. He was painted as a man who valued money over lives, and as if his whole life could be reduced to a still photograph. When the scandal peaked, the most dangerous thing was not the tabloids. It was the insinuation that the sabotage was not external, but internal, that a manager had cut corners. And that Michael had known. That insinuation was a weapon that turned investors into predators. It also had a human edge. It struck at the people who had trusted him, including the engineer who had spoken to Elena in a hallway and who had a way of looking at her like she was the only person in a room of noise. That man, named Carlos, had a daughter in Elena's class who once forgot her science kit and cried in the hallway. He had been loyal for years. When his name appeared on a list of suspects for negligence, it felt like someone had thrown him under a bus, because bus tires want rides. 3 scenes of escalation carried the narrative to its public breaking. The first was a vernissage where Michael and Elena attended as a public couple, and where an ex-lover staged a confrontation in front of patrons and in front of a camera that had been set on a tripod like a hungry eye. The second was a leak that suggested pairing between Michael's firm and a shadow company that should not have had contracts. The third was a technical failure at a scaffold in a mid-project, where an inspector's log had been altered. Each of these moments demanded forensic response. The technical descriptions were necessary to understand what followed. A forensic review of the scaffold involved analysis of tensile strength in the alloys used. Investigators took samples, measured chemical composition, and then scanned welds for microscopic fractures. They reconstructed timelines from GPS data in delivery trucks and matched those against inventory logs held on the company's server. Forensics showed that a batch of beams had been swapped for lighter-grade steel after leaving the supply yard, and CCTV revealed a shadowed figure tampering with the cargo seals. It was precise, small details that a gossip blog could not stomach because they required patience and knowledge. The work took weeks, and the team that Michael put together included Dr. Singh, an industrial engineer called Mara, and a security specialist named Dean who read manifestos like they were funerary inscriptions. They worked in rooms that smelled of coffee and solvent and felt like operating theaters. The panic culminated when the media printed a dossier that claimed Elena's rapid shift from arranged bride to public partner was a calculated PR maneuver by Michael to shield his company. The headline paired a photo of her smiling with a cut from the ceremony to suggest artifice. It took one woman's private humiliation and turned it into an advertising unit. Elena felt violated not only for her own privacy, but because her choices had become rhetorical devices. She walked into Michael's office and did not knock. He looked up from a stack of documents, and his right hand rested on a photograph of a construction blueprint. For the first time, she saw a man whose confidence had fissures. They argued, not loudly, but with the kind of intensity that rearranges rooms. She asked why he had not spoken sooner. He said he had been careful because one wrong word could be used as a weapon. She said that being careful felt like being hidden. He replied that protecting people sometimes means choosing which scandals to fight and which to absorb. Their exchange had long clauses. They spoke of trust and of the way systems failed workers, and of private apologies that could not be received in public. It was a rare conversation where both listened as much as they spoke. She said, "I did not come to be a shield." He answered, "You never were a shield. You were a person." He swallowed with a sound that might have been a confession. Then the sabotage story escalated into something that demanded accountability. Detective Morales called with news that the altered cargo seals bore traces of certain compounds and that the truck route had included a stop at a warehouse tied to a shell company. The evidence gathered by the forensic team pointed in the direction of someone connected to Georgia's circle. The discovery was not clean. It required more than proof. It required patience and the kind of legal choreography that moves like a slow tide. But it opened a line. When investigators put together phone records that matched delivery times with calls placed from phones registered to a subsidiary company in George's portfolio, the narrative unspooled. George denied involvement. He insisted that archaeology required evidence, not innuendo. He called his lawyers and prepared statements about protocol and honor. But the evidence, once assembled, had the weight of a weather front. Public pressure grew after a hearing where a foreman gave testimony about the day the scaffold bowed. His voice shook and he described the sound of metal complaining before it gave way. The hearing was televised. Michael sat beside his counsel and did not flinch when old colleagues testified that they had never seen him cut corners. The legal process was noisy and slow, and in that space, Elena had to decide whether to walk away into the simple anonymity of her earlier life or to stand and help build a narrative of truth. She chose to stay. The final unraveling happened in a courtroom where emotion revealed documents linking George to payments that were routed through intermediaries and then to a consultancy that had hired the same driver who had been seen near the warehouse. The prosecution argued that the payments had been intended to manufacture an accident that would depress stock and allow certain players to buy shares at lower rates. It was a complicated picture that required a jury to understand intent, and juries are clumsy with subtleties. But the chain of custody had been preserved. A phone with messaging threads, a ledger entry, and a man named Anton who had been hired only 2 weeks before the load had gone missing combined like evidence in a grand jury. Painting. The defense called everything conjecture, and George proclaimed himself a man of honor. The courtroom was a theater where loyalty played its last acts. George was arrested in a small room off the lobby, his hands cuffed with a slowness he did not anticipate. He said nothing as they led him away, but his face was a study in shame and relief. He looked at Elena with a grief that asked for forgiveness in the only language he actually knew. Elena, who had been taught to respect the elder, felt a complicated kind of pity. He had built a life out of the idea of protection and had been blinded by the calculus of power. He had miscalculated the human cost. There were public consequences. Investors who had been ready to flee saw the company stabilize when Michael's team issued transparent audits and when the forensic team presented a detailed public timeline of the sabotage. Naomi organized a press strategy that did not obfuscate. The tabloids, starved of simple villainies, had to shift narratives. A journalist named Priya wrote a long piece that humanized the workers and that described the technical forensic work in a way readers could grasp. Detective Morales gave measured interviews that emphasized collaboration. The company set up a foundation to support injured workers and to audit supply chains with independent monitors. Such concrete actions turned a scandal into a chance for reform. Emotionally, the resolution was uneven. People do not untangle lives the way they shake loose string. Elena and Michael had to make choices that were public and private. He was cleared of criminal culpability by lack of direct intent, and because influence had been used as a weapon, not a proof of guilt. The court found George guilty on charges of conspiracy to defraud and tampering with safety. The verdict did not give Elena joy. It gave her release and a torrent of unexpected sorrow. In the months after the trial, Elena made decisions about her career with the full glare of scrutiny. She took a leave from teaching to write a column about safety in schools and about choices made by women under pressure. She felt the pull of returning to the classroom and also the pull of creating systems that prevented people like Carlos from being collateral. There were moments of raw tenderness that felt like breath after a storm. On the 1-month mark from the hearing, Michael surprised her with a picnic on the roof of his company's community center. He had procured a small portable radio and he had brought a blanket that smelled of lavender. They ate sandwiches and watched children with paint on their cheeks run along a painted mural. He told her then that he had been wrong to try to be the only one who protected her. He said, "I wanted to carry everything so you would not hurt. I have learned that protection is also letting people decide." She answered with, "Honestly, I needed you to see me." He said, "I see you." The simplicity of the exchange felt like a contract neither of them needed to sign. They agreed to work on trust that did not feel like armor. At 3 months, Elena resumed a part-time teaching position. She returned to a classroom that smelled of wax and paper and chalk dust. The students clustered like small planets around a teacher who had been in headlines. She spoke to them not only of Newton's laws, but of responsibility and choices. She invited engineers to talk about safety. She organized a small field trip to a construction site where Carlos now supervised a safety audit. The students asked questions about courage and about what it meant to stand for something. Elena answered from experience. She told them that bravery sometimes looks like staying put and changing outcomes from inside the room. At 6 months, they were married, but not in the great hall where relatives had once staged destiny. They married on a cold morning in a courthouse garden under a thin sun. The ceremony was short and intentionally human. There were no cameras, only the close circle of Naomi, Elliot, Omar, Dr. Singh, Rosa, Javier, Sam the guard, and Carlos, who carried his daughter on his shoulders. Michael's vow was not a proclamation of ownership. He spoke of partnership and of learning to be visible to someone else. Elena's vow was not a surrender. She spoke of choosing and of the strange courage it takes to name what is yours. After the ceremony, they walked to a small trattoria where they ate pasta and laughed about things that had once felt impossible. The epilogue of their story was not tidy. A foundation had been established in the name of accountability and of worker safety. The company changed procurement policies and introduced independent audits. George served time, and in the letters he wrote from a cell, he tried to articulate an apology that did not quite fit into language. He asked for forgiveness in the only way he knew how, which was to admit that his measures had been cruel and that he had believed that control was care. Elena visited him once, a brief meeting with clear boundaries and no more absolution than a person can afford to give. She left with a compassion that did not excuse. 1 month later, she had started writing a weekly column that combined policy and personal essays. She wrote about alliances and about how women are often drafted into old scripts. She wrote about the engineer who taught her to read beams like sentences, and about the students who made her laugh during detention because they had found a way to make a basic science problem into a story. The column grew a following and attracted readers who wrote back with their own stories. 3 months later, the foundation had funded a pilot program that trained site inspectors, offered stipends for whistleblowers. 6 months later, the company reported a drop in accidents at sites it managed and an increase in community trust. They held an open day where neighbors could tour a project and see for themselves how materials were tested. The images from that day were simple and powerful. Workers showing children how to wear a hard hat, a table of spotless sample beams being tested for tensile strength, a group of engineers answering questions. Elena learned that rescue stories do not have to fit the script she had been given at 23. Her arranged marriage had been forced and unjust. It had been a period she would always carry, but it had been part of a longer pattern that she and Michael unraveled together. He was not a perfect man, and he was not a myth. He made mistakes, and he took consequences. He also learned to speak in a way that invited accountability. Their life was a project, ongoing and imperfect. The last image the narrative left was quiet. They stood at dusk on a rooftop garden a year after the scandal settled. The city lay like an atlas beneath them, the lights a constellation rearranged. He turned to her and said, "You were never an arrangement. You were a choice." She smiled and leaned into him as if into an answer. If this story made you feel something that touched memory or sorrow, share it below with "When I Spoke Up" so others can read and know they are not alone. If you want more stories about people who choose to rewrite their lives, subscribe and join the conversation.